Men who instinctively take personal responsibility for themselves and their families eventually realize that being atomized, rootless cosmopolitans inhibits their ability to exercise their willpower. Male agency naturally leads into the creation of a patriarchy. Raise your sons to be strong, masculine and dominant. Raise your daughters to be soft, feminine and submissive. The bad behavior that we see from women today is simply a rebellion against men's failure to benevolently dominate. The failure of Western society is a failure to maintain the patriarchy.
But we're bringing it back. It's episode 19 of Patriarch Hour. I'm James Fox-Higgins, and I'm joined as ever by Noah Ravoy. How are you, Noah?
I'm doing great. So there are some misconceptions. And there is also not just misconceptions about patriarchy, but about the role of men in society and about what it means to be a man. And all of this has been distorted. It makes sense if you want to control people and you can control the language. You know, those who have sought to undermine Western society have put a lot of effort into being the ones controlling language. They infiltrated the academy, the universities, and from there, they have influenced how we describe things. And when they control language, they control thoughts and they control actions. And even, you know, we just saw a recent example of this with the concept of sexual preference being turned from a normal thing. And in about 24 hours, the whole process went through from a bunch of radical activists saying there's no such a thing, all the way through to getting backed up by the academy, to it actually getting changed in the online dictionaries.
Did that happen? Wow, yeah, that's unbelievable. And all of it is really an exercise or a demonstration of their insistence that we have no agency and we can't have agency, that we can't choose, that we just are what we are, we're born this way, and we have no ability to transform ourselves or improve ourselves or make any choices that are rational or decide what's actually good for us or not. We're just slaves to our impulses and we're born that way. And that's not a world that I want to live in, frankly.
No, and I can almost understand them perceiving it that way, because many of them have no agency. They've chosen not to develop agency, but they want to pretend that it is impossible for anyone to have a preference, essentially. Now the concept of preferences has become offensive. It's actually what it says in the dictionary now. The concept of preference when it comes to sexual orientation is offensive. I was born the way I am, and I can't possibly have preferred that way. It was forced upon me by my genetics. And it is an effort to not just take away people's agency, but I believe very strongly that they're attempting to make excuses for their own behavior, so that, you know, we already have under the law, we understand that if a person is mentally diseased, that they have less culpability for committing a crime. And I believe very strongly that they're trying to lay a legalistic framework right in the minds of the population to excuse behavior that goes far beyond simply them choosing to have sex with someone else. I think it's abusive behavior that they're trying to lay out an excuse for, and they're trying to give themselves legal cover. And I think this will come out more and more over the next few months. They've been working for a long time to normalize, not just legalize, but normalize things like pedophilia and incest and this type of things. And these are the kind of things that a patriarchy would prevent from happening. They would not allow, you know, a patriarchy protects women and children. If it doesn't protect them, it's not a patriarchy. You can have rule by men that isn't patriarchy. It is simply a dictatorship. But if it's protecting women and children, then it's a patriarchy, because you're, as patriarchy coming from the word father, you know, the rule of fathers, and to be a father, you must love and protect your children. If you don't, you might be biologically a father, but you're not living up to the role that it means to be a father. Yes, you've abdicated. Yeah, it is important to understand, though, that a lot of the language, even of those who are anti-feminist, a lot of their thinking about patriarchy was gifted to them by feminists, and they need to expunge those ideas from their head in order to properly look at and evaluate what it would be like to live under a patriarchy. But the real answer to that is that patriarchy doesn't impose other people's morals on you. It imposes reciprocity. And it imposes it on both men and women. Personal choices have public consequences. And when they have public consequences, we have a right to seek redress for the costs that are imposed upon us as a society. If you are having children you can't take care of, with women you're not willing to commit to, you are imposing a cost on society. We either are going to have to, we're either going to let them starve to death or we're going to feed them. But either way, it's going to be our cost. If we let them starve to death, it will be our cost on our conscience. If we feed them, it'll be a cost in our pocketbook, which means less children for us. And even if we do feed them and they grow up and, they have some place in society, they'll grow up without the benefit of a father, which means they're going to end up, not being a good fit for a patriarchal society. And they may even try to undermine it. And that's what we see right now is it's mostly fatherless mothers, or fatherless women and fatherless men who are undermining Western civilization. So we have a right to impose certain limits on behavior when that behavior imposes costs on society.
But I think one of the other great tricks that they've played on us is to reduce our time preference or our time horizons and our perceptions of, the consequences of our choices. So people quite earnestly, I think, believe that their life simply belongs to them and that the actions that they take may have consequences for them, but it's nobody else's business. And what you're indicating here is a difference in time preference where we say, well, actually, your choices will, in the time that you're alive, they will ripple out and affect others in ways that you can't necessarily account for. But beyond that, across multiple generations, certain behaviors degenerate the quality of our society, degenerate the quality of our people, and actually become a cost on the commons, which are our shared properties, which include our gene pool, our culture, our public spaces and how people behave in them. All of these things are our shared properties as members of a society. And if you're making choices now that smarter and wiser men have the perception to see that a few generations down the line is going to degenerate our culture and our society, then we have a moral right to intercede now and prevent you from doing that. So it's not simply an arbitrary morality that's being applied within the patriarchal model. It's actually natural law being enacted, and men who are perceptive enough, usually because they're historically literate enough to understand the way that behaviors roll out over time and the way that the cycles of behavior affect us historically in different societies. So we're simply seeing a bigger picture than they're able to see. And I think that's part of how they've enslaved us, really, is to get us to live this sort of moment-by-moment lifestyle. And it's hedonistic, to live for the moment, to live for the pleasure of the moment, live for the now. A lot of that teaching is what has corrupted our society and made us rife and vulnerable to these kinds of cultural attacks, even though they don't seem necessarily bad. Just let people be, right? Live and let live seems like a good idea until you start to think about the longer term consequences.
And very often the consequences don't happen in the same generation where the negative behavior begins. There's a book, an excellent book that I suggest anyone who's really interested in understanding the impact of sex and culture on history and the development of civilization is to read a book called Sex and Culture by Unwin. And in there he explains that any civilization that was to restrict drastically sexual conduct, that means ideally no sex before marriage, no sex outside of marriage, and only marriage for people who have reached an age of majority and adulthood, which will vary in different times in history. But those cultures within 3 generations had achieved a level of immense growth and development, and they start to really flourish within 3 generations. And any culture which removed those restrictions, and he goes through different levels of how it was removed, it tends to be a slippery slope. Perhaps it starts with some sex before marriage and then sex outside of marriage, and eventually marriage itself stops having anything to do with sex and it completely breaks down. Those societies within 3 generations decayed. Now, this doesn't mean that the society ended, but it stopped developing. And once it stops developing, it's only a matter of time before a neighboring society will elevate itself sufficiently, a neighboring society which, by the way, has a patriarchy deeply restricting the sexual behavior of its people, will ascend sufficiently that they crush the stagnant society. And this has repeated itself over and over again throughout history. He looks at dozens of examples of this. Sexual energy is the creative life force, life-giving energy of a society. And when it is wasted in unwholesome or unhealthy ways, it's not being used for the development of science and culture and music and art and the development of people. And so we have a limited amount of this kind of energy, and we have to direct it in the way that is most productive. And a lot of this has to do with with how we raise our children as well, and children that are raised in a wholesome, sexually repressed civilization that is frank and honest about sex, but doesn't, for example, believe that it's okay for children to have sex, as modern society is trying to push on us right now. These children grow up safe. They grow up safe from predators, safe from unhealthy explorations at a very young age. And so they grow up with careful understanding of what the boundaries are. It's very easy for them then to make decisions that are healthy for them. Sorry, could you put that quote back?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
I can do whatever I want. Yeah. They don't hurt anyone else. And the reason is as you mentioned, they have this very short time preference.
So just for the podcast listeners, it says, I can do whatever I want as long as I don't hurt anyone else. Next minute, destroys family stability and social cohesion. That's from JDK52. Thanks, brother. That's a great comment. Really hits the nail on the head.
That's exactly what it is. And it's like this. Let's put it in cake terms. So they eat a cake, they feel sick, but they're like, no, I didn't make anyone else feel sick. I didn't make anyone else eat the cake. Their limit is 5 minutes from they did the act. Nothing bad happened.
So might as well do it tomorrow, right? Might as well just have another cake.
Yeah, might as well have another cake and another cake.
I mean, it did. I mean, I felt a little queasy, but no harm, no foul. Might as well have a cake every day.
And what's interesting
seems to be a problem.
And what's interesting is the damage that one individual does to society is diluted by the general strength of society.
Yeah.
But imagine if every man in a culture, every man in a nation was to let himself go physically, was to become weak and soft and effeminate, maybe fat, when he's eating too many cakes, or maybe just weak. How long would that civilization survive? History tells us no more than 3 generations. It's been about 2 generations that we've allowed Western men in the majority to become weak and soft and pathetic and effeminate.